They drew a circle and shut me out. A heretic, I think to flout. But Love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle, and we drew them in. I have no idea when I first learned that little poem, but I remember one particular occasion when it became a living reality for me. It was 1957. I was 26 years old. I spent 2 years in the Army, one of which was in Korea during that unforgettable war. Had graduated from seminary and had come home to Alabama in a turbulent time to accept an appointment as the pastor of the Autogaville Circuit of the Methodist Church. A circuit could, in those days, could consist of one church or several, and in my case it was 6 churches in Black Belt, Alabama. I moved in, and as we were moving in, about the first day or so, I met the pastor of the Black Baptist Church. And on the street, big man, had to be 6'7" or 80, 350 pounds or so. And I could remember meeting him on the sidewalk, and he said, "You're the new reverend." I said, "Yep." He said, "Well, I'm pastor of the Baptist church here, and I just want to know, are you God-called or dollar-called?" I knew what he meant. And I said, "Well, sir, God called me, but if you don't pay me, I'm leaving." And he laughed. We visited for a while, and he moved on. I had another visitor within the first week. George Sheridan came by. He was a member of one of the churches that I served. Introduced himself, and said, "I just want to welcome you to the community. Hope you'll be comfortable here." And we chatted for a while, and he said, "You know, I hope we don't have any trouble. Your predecessor, Reverend White, was a little too liberal for the area, and there was a lot of concern about that. And in fact, there was a rumor one time that the Klan was going to burn a cross in front of the parsonage." And, well, I knew David White, the former pastor. And I knew that if David was too liberal for the area, I was in deep trouble. I said, "Oh, I hope that doesn't happen. That would be terrible." George said, "Yeah, it would be." I said, "Well, it would be really terrible because I keep a shotgun just inside the front door, just in case something happens. And I can just imagine waking up in the middle of the night and having something like that going on out front, and shooting and maybe hitting somebody, maybe even killing somebody. I don't know whether I could live with that or not." George said, "Yeah, that really would be awful." And we chatted for a little bit, and he excused himself and left. And after he left, my wife said, "You don't even own a gun, much less a shotgun." And I said, "That's right." But George didn't know that. A couple of days later, I ran into Al Shanks, one of the members of the church, and he said, "I understand you had a visit from the Klan the other day." And I said, "I think so." It was a turbulent time in the mid to late 50s because the social system, the rigid social system that had kept the races separate, and the African American population subjugated for so many years, ever since the Civil War, was coming unraveled. And it was not without a lot of concern, a lot of anger, and some violence. One of the things that happened as we lived there is that my wife asked Hattie, one of the African American women, if she could help her one day a week. it wasn't so much that we needed the help. We had 2 children, but this was the way that most of the African American women made a little money. And I can remember that pretty well because we paid Hattie a pittance, but it was twice as much as everybody else was paying. And it was enough to cause a couple of members of my church, a couple of ladies, suggest to me that maybe we were paying too much. I felt guilty about not paying enough, but we were in that system. Hattie and I talked occasionally when she would come to clean, and along in December, we were coming up on Christmas. Hattie said one day, "Reverend, why don't you come down to our church Christmas?" And I said, "Well, Hattie, that's not a bad idea." And the Black Baptist Church was just a little ways down the street from me. And so I let it go at that. And then the day before Christmas Eve, Hattie was at the house, and she said, "Are you going to come to church?" And I said, "Well, yeah. What time is the service?" And she said, "Well, it's 6:30. Well, I don't know what I was thinking about, but I thought it was 6:30 Christmas Eve, because I knew most of the black folks would be busy on Christmas Day. And she said 6:30. And I said, "Well, I'll see you down there tomorrow night." She said, "No, 6:30 Christmas morning." I said, "Hattie, 6:30 in the morning?" Well, if I had stopped to think, I would realize they had to have their service over with so that they could go and cook and clean for members of my congregation. I said, "Hattie, if you can go to church at 6:30 in the morning, I can too." I had a 9:30 service scheduled, and I figured there'd be plenty of time. So about 6:15, Christmas morning, cold as it could be. Don't get much snow in Alabama, but it was a cold, damp, one of those kinds of days where the weather just goes to your bones. I got up and dressed and went down to the church. When I went in, there were only about 8 or 10 people there, and they were huddled down front around the stove. Well, I took a seat about halfway back, and as I started to sit down, somebody said, "Oh, Reverend, come on up and get warm. Don't you sit back there." And I said, "Well, okay." So I went up and huddled around. We introduced each other and visited a little bit. And a few minutes later, the preacher came in. This is that 6'8", 350-pound preacher who had met me the first week I was there. And he saw me sitting. But by this time I had moved back and had sat down next to the aisle about halfway back. And as he came by, he said, "Brother, come on up and sit in the pulpit with me." Well, there's no way I wanted to do that. I didn't want to intrude on the service. I said, no, I'll just sit back here. And he said, "Nonsense. God called you to preach. You sit in the pulpit." Well, I know that God takes many forms and is not an old gray-haired white man sitting somewhere in the heavens. And I believe that God is feminine as well as masculine and all of that. But I can tell you, I know what God sounds like. That morning, he sounded like a 350-pound, 6'8", Black Baptist preacher. So I went up and sat in the pulpit. Really didn't have much choice. And I can remember him standing up, taking the pulpit Bible and holding it like it was a pocket New Testament and reading the Christmas story. I will never forget that. He finished the story, laid the Bible back on the pulpit, and he said to the congregation, by this time about 35 people or so, "Sisters and brothers, we got a great privilege this morning. We got a chance to hear the Reverend Max Hale." Turned to me and said, "Preach, brother." And as a British Royal Navy chaplain friend of mine says, me flabbergasted. I had no idea what to say or what to do. I had a sermon prepared for my congregation. But in that era, in that time, I had things to say to my white congregation that were simply not appropriate to say to a black congregation. My congregation also expected a prepared sermon that was organized and that had point to it. A black congregation, on the other hand, expected the preacher to speak from the Spirit. I stood up. I acknowledged the welcoming. As I did, I noticed the pulpit Bible is sitting down where the preacher had left it. And he wasn't even turned to the New Testament, someplace in the Old Testament. He had that story memorized and had me mesmerized. Well, I acknowledged the welcome and I talked for a few minutes, and a couple of scriptures came to mind, and I kind of talked about that, and I talked for a while until I thought maybe it was okay for me to let it go. Nowhere near resembles a sermon. But about the time I'm getting ready to draw it to a conclusion, one of the men in the congregation said, yeah, I believe that. And a sister on the other side said, "Preach on, brother, preach." And I thought, well, I can't let it go now, so I proceeded to talk a little bit more. And every once in a while I'd hear somebody say, amen. Well, it became more frequent, and as it did, I got more involved, and I began to feel good. And so I talked for a while, and finally, I'd been going for about 45 minutes. I didn't realize that, and when I did, I pulled it to a close and I sat down. The preacher took over, ended the service with prayer, and dismissed the congregation. And as I was leaving, everybody was so welcoming and cordial and visiting. And I can remember one lady said to me, "That's a nice little talk you gave." Well, it was a great experience for me. By the time I got to my church at 9:30, I really was feeling good. Before my service started, as people started coming in, they started telling me, "I heard you went to the Black Baptist Church this morning." Word was out all over town. I was afraid it was going to cause some trouble. It did cause some people to talk, but nothing much other than that came of it. But one of the things that I thought about was that little poem that I learned years ago. "They drew a circle and shut me out, a heretic, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle and drew them in." And I thought about the hospitality that I had received. And I realized that in that time, it was a one-way hospitality between the congregations. They accepted me without any reservation. And all the time I was there, I never invited the preacher, the Black Baptist preacher, to preach in my congregation, because I knew he would not have been accepted. Hard time, I stayed there for 3 years and left and went to become a campus pastor. Good people. And as time has gone on, the structure has changed, of course, and you know the story. But I will always remember that time. It focused for me both the problem and the hope and the possibility of extending hospitality to your neighbor. I remember it well, and it's my privilege to have told the story to you.